In the history of the American Southwest, no one figure stands larger than Charles Fletcher Lummis. Largely forgotten today, Lummis is the man who coined the phrase Southwest. His activism in areas of archaeology, historic preservation, conservation, the revival of Hispanic culture, and the rights of Native Americans was not only prescient, but helped to define the mythic image of the region.
The boarding school system was an educational system that made Native peoples its subject. They were not participants in the system. And that lack of participation in an imposed educational system is still a legacy for American Indian people today.
In all the history of the three Americas, there has not been another Indian policy so cruel and so stupid as our present educational system.
Throughout his life, he always took on different Indian agents when he felt that they were wronging the children or wronging the families at the different reservations. And I just think this was one of his many, I hate to use the term crusades, but almost a crusade.
He felt strongly that the Indian way of life should be maintained and that the Indians should be allowed to live as much as possible as Indians.
At the close of the 19th century, author and journalist Charles Lummis was a national celebrity and acknowledged expert on the Southwest. By 1892, 32-year-old Lummis began to use his fame to draw attention to the issues of Native American rights.
Charles Lummis was an iconoclastic character from his childhood, it seemed. He was a very unique character, very curious, and didn't quite fit in.
He was dynamic, he was driven, he was a self-made man. I can say it this way, he's somebody I would like to have known, but I would never have wanted to be married to him.
As the Indian Wars came to an end, America was confronted with the problem of what to do with the 250,000 Indians living in the West. The Indian question, as it was known, was viewed as a choice between assimilation and extinction. William Henry Pratt favored forced assimilation. In 1879, he opened the Carlisle Indian School with the motto, "We kill the Indian to save the man."
When a child from any of these tribes was taken to these Indian schools, the first thing they did was they cut their hair. They couldn't sing their songs, they couldn't converse their native language. In lots of cases, they simply tried to also break them up from talking and interacting with their own tribes people.
At best, the boarding schools for the Native peoples were an assimilation process. At worst, they were an expression of the philosophy of manifest destiny, which had really been a spiritual, economic, social, and political rationale for Europeans to come to this country, conquer it, destroy the peoples in many ways, and assimilate them into their culture.
The move was to make them feel that their own parents were stupid, backward, ignorant, superstitious people.
Lummis moved to the Indian pueblo of Isleta in 1888. He befriended his landlord, Juan Ray Abeta, who had two older boys at the Albuquerque Indian School. Through Abeta, Lummis learned that the new superintendent, William Krieger, had adopted the Carlisle method of education and refused to allow any contact between Indian parents and their children.
Many of the parents in Isleta were certainly interested in educating their children, and so they willingly sent their kids to the Albuquerque Indian School under the regime that preceded Krieger. When Krieger arrived and changed the rules, they were a bit taken aback that they were unable to maintain contact with their children.
The Indian children were recruited in the communities themselves, but in instances where the recruitment didn't go the way that they had hoped through negotiation or through trying to instill cooperation from the leaders from the tribe, they simply kidnapped them.
One of the children from Isleta, Tuyo Abeta, was evidently forcibly grabbed.
When Lummis learned of Tuyo's kidnapping, he began a newspaper campaign to get all of the children returned. In the spring of 1892, Juan Ray Abeyta traveled to Albuquerque to visit his 3 boys. Krieger's henchmen beat Juan Ray and told him never to return.
At last, however, the Indians could stand it no more. Their Congress was convened, and I was summoned before it. We made a test case for Juan Ray Abeyta's 3 boys, suing out a writ of habeas corpus.
The writ of habeas corpus is one of the bedrock principles of the Anglo-American legal system. It forces the government to prove why it should be allowed to hold someone in prison.
The oppressors did not dare let the case come into court, even in New Mexico court. We got not only the 3 boys at issue, but half an hour before the case was to be called, I had the principal's legal contract to deliver to me that afternoon the 13 boys of his letter.
They probably realized they would lose, and they did not want a precedent in court. So the case ultimately was settled out of court. Several of the children were liberated immediately. Others were returned within a week or 2.
And when Tuyo, the baby, was brought home by me to his parents, he could not talk to them. My wife, who learned the Indian tongue, had to interpret for boy and mother. And Pita, as fine and motherly a woman as I ever knew, cried. And Tuyo cried. And I think so did we all.
It really was kind of a shot that was heard around the world as far as Indian education was concerned, because what it basically meant was that it set a precedence, including Carlisle, that children could not be held against their parents' will.
I think Lummis's campaign clearly had a major impact. Later that year in Congress, a measure was enacted requiring boarding schools to get the permission of parents in order to take Indian children away from their homes and place them in distant boarding schools.
Lummis thought that he was right. And anytime he felt he was right, he would go after anybody, whether it was the federal government, the president, or an Indian agent.